Right, let's get reaction now on this, and we are joined by Build One South Africa leader, Mmusi Maimane, who's with us in the studio, has been reacting, I see, on Twitter to what has been coming out, really, out of the speech. Let's begin first by looking at what the minister says in terms of the economic outlook, right? Yeah. We've got, what, close to 9 million people who are unemployed in the country currently, which means the GDP needs to be growing at a higher level than what it's currently growing. His projection is that it's no longer going to be 2.1%, it's going to be 1.9%, and will probably remain that way for the next 6 years. Do you think that's something that is worrying him?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I mean, first and foremost, that is our biggest crisis, right? I think South Africa's growth trajectory, to your point, is been pointing downwards over the next period. The tragedy is that we have a government that seems to be ignorant of that reality. Furthermore, I think that even in today's budget speech, there didn't seem to be close attention being paid to what some of the initiatives that can be to be able to incentivize growth, to be able to say to ourselves, how do we help micro-enterprise? How do we make sure that on a broader scale of things, all our initiatives are focused on job creation? It feels like we have a government that simply has realized that it's running out of options and is just trying to keep, almost as holding a bucket with multiple holes, just to try and keep hands on holes, but actually no ideas about how do we grow, how do we ensure our young people are educated, and how do we ensure that over the medium term, the picture for South Africans is one that people can say, we will stabilize, get better, and grow from there.
He seems to be saying that, look, we've already begun with the structural reforms, which I'm sure you know, it's something that you've been talking about in Parliament for 15 years now, and we're still saying, okay, we are at least beginning to make some progress. The spectrum has now been auctioned off. We are waiting now for digital migration in order to free the spectrum that has been auctioned off. There is some conversation around a third party getting access to the ports. There is some conversation around transmission and distribution and generation being split at Eskom. Is it too little, too late, or is that progress that we do need to see that could take us to the 6% type of growth that we want to see?
Well, the most urgent things that I believe need to be done, and one of them today was about stability around Eskom, right? Trying to make sure that we keep the lights on, because no economy is going to grow. It doesn't matter what your digital migration strategy is. It doesn't matter what your any other economic program that you put. No economy will grow without energy. And I thought today that the idea of looking just only the debt of Eskom without trying to say how do we as government take the lead in being able to stimulate the renewal program, ensure that part of the plants that have been built are functioning well as a matter of urgency to stabilize, was at least one intervention, but more can be done. You're not going to build an economy without an efficient water system. Clearly, our infrastructure is in proper decay. And more crucially, there didn't seem to be a conversation about what local government does. I mean, you and I are sitting here today looking at what happens at all of these metros, but the fact of the matter is that the economy of Johannesburg is crucial to ensuring that micro-enterprise can work. And if that infrastructure isn't working, then ultimately business confidence is low. So I did feel that more than anything, when you look at the broad picture, it was probably a well-balanced budget and a statement to make and a signaling to make. The greatest difficulty is that government doesn't seem to have the capability to implement. It has caved on many issues, and ultimately, let's dare never forget, this is a state that is fairly corrupt in its broad practice, and so any financial resource you put on there is leaked through this corrupt tool that benefits only a few individuals at the benefit of the many. What I would have liked to see is to simply say, here are 4 or 5 priority areas, particularly for the next number of years, focused on ultimately infrastructure, ensuring that we keep a venture capital for micro-enterprise to go forward, keep our citizens healthy. I welcome that we're fixing Charlotte Maxeke, but that's not really enough. It's about making sure that the state's capability is able to respond. And then, more than anything, when you look at the broad government, it's a big government. Today, the public sector wage bill was given a 3% increase. But what isn't being said is how do we curb the number of ministries, or how do we ensure that actually that government is efficient, so that on matters such as getting licenses for business or getting through the home affairs or the various aspects, that those things are responsive for economic growth. South Africa's big dilemma is that, fair enough, in an international climate, you could say we are all under pressure. but we've got some serious comorbidities that we need to fix so that ultimately we can be much more resilient and effective at coming forward. So this the surplus that we're experiencing this year should in fact be invested into growth areas rather than just simply plugging holes.
Talking about the division of the surplus and I suppose the share that is being given to the various arms of government, national, provincial and local, 10% only going to local government and 50 or above 50 going to national and the rest going to the provinces. In terms of their focus, it's been debated that the share is not enough that is being given to local in terms of where the changes need to happen.
Yeah, and this is where I would argue that state capture at local government level will make state capture at national level look like a picnic. And I say that against the backdrop of, if you look at rural municipalities, you have stadia being built in Enoch Godongwana that simply look like a joke. Yeah. And more than anything, there's this, because the accountability is less there, ultimately citizens are feeling the effects of it the most. So if you are a resident of Johannesburg, for argument's sake, today, as we sit here today, you are without, generally, some people without water, most people without electricity, we have no mayor. All of these dilemmas indicate the fact that once you start to put money into local government, we also need to capacitate local government better so that ultimately that's where the rubber hits the road. You are not going to trade in a city that cannot get you water or make you feel safe or ultimately keep the lights on. So to me, I think the lack of focus at local government and the lack of focus on local economic development, which is where most of the jobs are going to come from, is in fact a misdirection by this government. But it ultimately speaks to a broader problem of the fact that this is a government without clear priorities and ultimately an ability to execute against, and ministries that are not functioning in that space.
As a resident of the Gauteng province, you welcome the scrapping of ETO. It's not really scrapping because from what I'm hearing, yes, National is going to take 70% of the debt and province, the Premier saying, no, we still need to work out a model and agree with the people of Gauteng. How are we going to pay for this? So ultimately it means either way, we're still going to pay for it somehow.
Yeah. But it's a victory for citizens. You'll remember when the e-tolls was being mooted, I was one of the people who was at the forefront of marching against it. I said, this is a scheme that is unworkable. We chose the most expensive technology to try and hurry up a process of building roads and introduced a model that was never going to work. Yeah. It was common cause. So now as residents, we're being penalized twice. Yeah. We rejected the idea, we're forced to pay, now we're forced to pay for government's failures. Yeah. When everybody, and even still today, it's a difficult choice to make today, everybody called for an increase in the fuel levy at the time, or that redirection of the fuel levy towards road infrastructure build, particularly for Gauteng. Because all of us agree we need functioning road infrastructure. Yeah. The difficulty is how do you aggregate that and make it efficient for people to be able to contribute to building roads. And we failed that test. Now today we've got a ballooning debt, SANRAL in trouble, and citizens again are being asked to pay. So I welcome the fact that citizens don't have to pay anymore. I think that's an important intervention. What I would argue is that we need an integrated transport plan so that where citizens say, A, I can't be on the road, what's the plan around rail? What's the plan around the bus system? And what's the plan certainly around goods being transported around Gauteng? Because that's going to matter for economic trade in this country.
Is he simply paying lip service? I mean, he speaks there of the excess income going to reducing the deficit. Many are saying, well, the debt is now going in the right direction from what we're hearing. But infrastructure, of course, is something that we all know needs to be spent on. But he speaks of spending on things like education, health, and policing. And has he got a plan exactly as to where that money is going to go in terms of education, in terms of the health and the policing?
It's capability, right? I welcome the introduction of 15,000 potentially new policemen. Yeah. But at the end
By the way,
day,
it was supposed to be 30, and he says it's because we are paying for the social relief of distress grant, so we had to cut it down to 15,000.
Even at that point, we're still woefully below what we need to do. Remember, international norms calculate the ratio of citizens to policemen, and I think South Africa is still low on that score. And The difficulty about policing is that actually it's not even just a money problem, it's about the data problem. The police don't know what they don't know. Intelligence is dysfunctional, as we can see now with the threats that are coming into the country, and prioritization in the police. You know, we don't prioritize murder. I think that what we need to be doing as a country is rather than only just increasing the number of police, we need to step up and say, we're going to prioritize murder. If you murder anyone in this country, we ought to lock you up. And we ought to build the criminal justice system to make sure that the murderers are in jail. So from a budget allocation point of view, it isn't just a question of increasing manpower, but it's the capability. You speak to an ordinary police person, they'll tell you straight up, they don't have the resources, often they don't have the vehicles, and often they don't have the requisite intelligence to be able to respond appropriately to crime. On healthcare, I do think that perhaps part of what we need to do is making sure that we appoint the appropriate leadership in the respective hospitals. Because there again, it's not going to be a question of just simply saying, let's pump more money into the health system. The fact is, at lower, particularly at primary healthcare level, citizens don't get the best service there, even with the current resources available. So let's be clear about what our priorities are, so that when the President tables next year's State of the Nation and the next budget comes on subsequent to that, it can be an alignment between here are government's priorities, here's how we fund them, and here's where the accountability sits. Instead, we've got a government that today sought to balance us out of a very difficult position. But in truth, it means over the medium term and over the long term, the direction South Africa is heading towards is one of a country that is highly indebted, low growth, stagnant in terms of what they call stagflation, increasing inflation over a period of time, and citizens who are losing work. So we've got to reprioritize what we focus on.
Putting brakes on the basic income grant at this particular point, I mean, saying it's a continuation of the SDR at least up until 2024, but he says we can't be making a permanent commitment to something until we know exactly how we're going to fund it. At this particular point, we're making a sacrifice elsewhere in order for us to continue to fund it.
Sure, but let's recognize the fact that post-COVID citizens are hungry. The majority of people in this country are living below the upper poverty line. So, and that relief grant is important to not only be seen as a temporary measure of welfare, but it ought to be seen in terms of the increase of money flow, particularly in that low income bracket. So there's an economic benefit to the issue when you look at it over the long term. I've certainly been one of the supporters of basic income. I think especially in a targeted way, looking at particular communities that are vulnerable and young people in that space, simply because I think that South Africa is not going to be able to create enough jobs in the short period of time to be able to deal with that. There can be no denial. Even for citizens, you speak to the hungriest citizen in the country, they will tell you they are desperate to find work. So ultimately, even the reprioritization of that funding ought to then move to the next gear, which is how do we help micro-enterprise, particularly in communities, be able to employ people so that it gives not only economic participation but economic dignity. So I would argue that over the long period of time, taking that income and assisting in making sure that it funds certain micro-enterprise would probably be an ideal way to go over a long period of time.
Mr. Maimane, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming in tonight. One South Africa leader, Mmusi Maimane, reacting to the midterm budget presentation made earlier on by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana.